Today is Friday, November 4, 2011. My name is Mark Depew, the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and I'm here in Elmhurst again, actually in the office of former Speaker Lee Daniels. Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning. It's a little better day than it was the other day.
Yeah, it was raining all day.
It is, and the sun is actually shining in beautiful Elmhurst.
But I think we'll probably still have an opportunity to hear a little bit of background music, i.e. the railroads in the background here.
Yes, we contribute to the nation's economy.
But I've been impressed by how many railroads go through this town. Yesterday we finished off with this fascinating story about your baptism down in Springfield and the speaker selection process. And that was quite an interesting story, and as you already talked about, you end up learning a lot about how the legislature works. But what I wanted to pick up now is if you can tell me a little bit more about your education and the process in which you learned how legislation is really crafted down in Springfield.
Well, I learned pretty quickly because after casting the vote for Speaker Redmond, of course, the initial view of a lot of people was that I had to go in the back room and cut a deal. I had not. And they expected, of course, that I would be named a chairman of a committee or some kind of benefits. I did get a benefit, and the benefit was I had a lot of friends on the Democrat side that liked me. So when I would handle some legislation for a particular cause, many times when the bill went up for a vote, I got a substantial number of Democrat votes and then supplemented that with Republicans and was able to pass the bill. I was, as I said earlier, very close to Gene Hoffman, former legislator, now unfortunately passed away, but Gene Hoffman was in his, I believe, his fourth term when I joined the General Assembly. And Gene, of course, mentored me in terms of how to handle legislation and so forth. And with a training in law, which I think it helps you a lot when you go into government, I was aware of the basic structures of government. And building upon that, I was able to learn pretty quickly. But I would add this. I served in the legislature for 32 years. Every day, I learned something new in Springfield. Every single day. The process is complicated, it's complex, it's involved, sometimes not pretty, but it's a process that works, and frankly, when you're able to understand what you're doing, it's a process that can be very helpful to people in their struggles in life, or for that matter, what government should be doing.
This might be a little bit of a peculiar question. You mentioned that there were several Democrats after this brutal battle to select the speaker who liked you. Is
Thank God somebody liked me. My wife still liked me.
Was being liked and being respected as a legislator two different things?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I can tell you, moving forward in time, people liked Blagojevich. He was a very likable guy. He was outgoing, he was a gregarious person, he was engaging, and I think a lot smarter than he pretended to be. But they didn't respect him, because he didn't work, he never studied the process, he didn't stand for anything, he didn't help people get things done, and so absolutely there's a difference.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what the legislature was like in '75 when you first joined.
Well, it became very polarized, as evidenced by the speakership election. Governor Walker was the governor. Most legislators had no respect for him and didn't care for him. And it was an interesting phenomena to watch the Democrats actually plan ways in which they could bring him down. And of course, for the most part, the Republicans sat back and watched. And such as budgetary items or any legislation that the governor wanted. He, without a doubt, was as you know, was a corporate lawyer, very, very smart person, but rode in on a policy of change and was unable to completely comprehend how important it was to work with the leaders that were there for a while and understood the process. So there was a polarized system, and of course we had a huge difference of opinion as to how the process should work in terms of the election of a speaker, which I've already talked about. But then, of course, at the end of the day, everyone does understand you got to get your work done. We had to balance the budget. We had to finish our basic work, and we went about doing just that. And I was able to establish a number of friendships, including Mayor Harold Washington, as I stated previously, who was the chairman of my Judiciary Committee that I was on. And I was pleased with that relationship because that carried me forth when he was elected mayor. I always had an opportunity to go in to see him. I would say a little bit dysfunctional in 1975. Democrats worked through it, and of course the ensuing election kind of solidified things a little bit more for them.
Some of the people I talked to about that time period in the legislature wax a little bit nostalgic about, oh, the good old days when it was much more collegial than it became in the 90s and 2000s.
There's no question about that. It was much more collegial. You know, you had a tendency, of course, in my case, I had as many friends on the Democrat side as I did on the Republican side. When some of the animosity started to dissipate towards me because of the vote by some of the people, I still maintained that close relationship with Democrats. And of course, I was an average member. I didn't have to stand on the House floor and expound on policy of the Republican Party and why we differ and why we're so much better than the Democrats. So I wasn't out there to really be a hard charger on setting the policy of the Republicans in the House. That came later.
You mentioned Governor Walker, Dan Walker. Was there some rumors during the last half of his administration about some things going on in his private life?
Oh, yes. Both Pate and I were recipients of support from a lady by the name of Roberta Nelson, and she lived right here in Elmhurst. And Roberta Nelson worked for Ray Graham Center for the Handicapped. It was called Handicapped at that time. And she asked if we could introduce her to Governor Walker on behalf of Ray Graham. And both Pate and I said we'd be happy to, and we did that. And they had a meeting, and then a few weeks later she asked if we could set up another meeting, which we did. The governor and Roberta had a meeting, and then that was the last call we got to set up the meetings because she handled them herself. A few years later, he ended up marrying Roberta Nelson from Elmhurst.
But was it a well-known
secret? It started to become a rumor that was pretty obvious because she ended up appearing in Springfield a lot. I don't know anything personal about it. I never talked to her about it, nor did I talk to the governor about it, obviously.
Where did you live when you were down in Springfield?
Well, over my tenure down there, I lived in several different places, but normally I would start with a hotel or a motel, and I bounced back and forth between the Hilton and the State House Inn.
Those were the Republican places?
No, not necessarily. Those were the places that were convenient and easy to live in, and I ended up later on living in a house and sharing it with Tom Ewing, who later became Congressman Tom Ewing. Tom and I were roommates for several years. And then I ended up moving into, when I became the minority leader, I ended up moving into my own place. And I bought a condominium down there, which I ended up selling a few years later for the same thing I paid for it, so property values didn't go up. And moved over by Washington Park because I like to run in the morning. Every morning I'd run 3 miles, and stayed in that general area.
Was there much of a social life going on for the legislators when the legislation?
Yeah, particularly for the average member, because you finished your day, you finished your committees, and things were done. And you'd arrange dinners, and you generally had dinners with your colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Where are you going to meet tonight? Paradise Restaurant, which today is Ross Isaacs. And where are you going to meet? The Wheel. I can't remember the first name of that restaurant down in MacArthur. And then, of course, when I first started down there, the Southern Air was just starting to get towards its legendary history. Now it's Chesapeake Bay, but then it was called the Southern Air, where a lot of legislators would go to dinner.
Was it a seafood house at that time?
No, it was a regular restaurant, and very popular, very well attended, and the bar was very busy.
You hear colorful stories dating back to the 60s and the 50s about the kinds of things that legislators did when they were down in Springfield.
Yeah, they would eat good meals.
Oh, but I'm talking about the...
I know what you're talking about.
Was that toned down quite a bit by the time you got there?
You know, pretty much it can always exist. I remember you have people that are away from their families. And so when they're away from their families for 6 months, people think it's an exciting life and full of wonderful times. It's not. It's hard work, and particularly if you're in the leadership role. And it's one that if you do it right, you're going to spend a lot of time at. But if you're an average member, you have a lot of time on your hands while the leaders are doing the work and posturing things for your caucus. So many times you would arrange these dinners, and the social life could be quite extensive if that's what you wanted.
But that social life, I would imagine, bleeds right into figuring out the legislative issues as well?
Oh, absolutely. I can't tell you how many arrangements, you call them deals, whatever you want to call, that we put together over a cocktail napkin or at a dinner or meeting with somebody. I know in my later years, I used the dinner to get closer to my members. And I would make sure during the course of a session that I had every member at some point in time had dinner with them.
Were you married at the time when you first went down to Springfield?
Yes.
Okay. Was she living in Elmhurst?
Yes.
She stayed in Elmhurst?
Yes, she was my second wife. Susan K. Spencer was her name. She's now deceased. And we did not have any children, but I have 2 stepsons by her. And we divorced when I was 39 years old.
What was it like trying to keep a practice going in Elmhurst at the same time you've got this very busy legislative career as well?
It was difficult, and it required an incredible amount of work. And I would generally, when we were in session, go down on Monday and come back on Thursday night. So that meant, as far as my law practice, I would have, and that's what you're referring to, I assume.
Right.
In terms of my law practice, I would have to work lots of times by telephone, and remember that early times it was by hard lines, and deal with my clients, and then have my partners take care of the cases while I was in Springfield. And when I'd come back, I ended up working on weekends, and similar to what I did in law school. So it was difficult. And ultimately, it was to the advantage of my clients and to my career as a lawyer to join a major Chicago law firm, which I did do.
What was the law firm?
Katten, Mushin, and Zavis. Katten, Mushin, M-U-C-H-I-N, and Zavis, Z-A-V-I-S. And I joined them in 1983, and as one of their partners. I was an equity partner going in with them. I was practicing with my father, and I had practiced with my dad for 17 years, and said to my dad, you know, I'm having trouble handling my work. And he said, yeah, but I'm doing all your work while you're in Springfield. And my dad said something, isn't it supposed to be the other way around? Aren't you supposed to be taking over the practice and doing my work? I said, well, Dad, what are dads for?
Well, this is the guy who told you that he didn't want to have anything to do with politics,
That's
right?
correct. And he's doing my legal work while I'm in Springfield.
What were the initial issues and legislative efforts that you wanted to pursue that first session?
What I wanted to do was to make a difference in terms of the quality of life of people. And of course, lots of times, you know, you'd go to Springfield and people would come to you. Lobbyists can be very, very helpful and very good by bringing major issues to your attention. And one of the things that I wanted to concentrate on, because of my experience with my children, was helping the disability community. And early on in my career, I started working in that. Specialized living centers, which gave rise, and I worked with Speaker Redmond on that, which gave rise to places where an organization that specialized in the physically and mentally challenged individuals could live if they needed a residential setting. We passed the first specialized living center legislation, as a matter of fact, working with Ray Graham, and put that into law And I believe it was 1976, 77 in that area, a little foggy on the exact date. But that's one of the areas that I wanted to focus on and did focus on for my whole legislative career.
That end of the first session, I understand you received an honor.
I did. Rocky start. And as people found out, there were no deals cut. This was because I considered Bill Redmond to be an honorable man. I knew he would be fair. And as I learned more about the legislative process, I became more aware of that my decision was the right decision. It was the right thing to do for the right reasons. And so I was very happy and proud about that, because when you make a decision like that that's so monumental, you want to have an assurance that you've done the right thing. And I did. And he was fair, where I think some of the other individuals on the Democrat side that were running for Speaker would have been very partisan. And Bill Redmond, although he was at the time a partisan, he still was fair to the minority party, which of course I served in. So at the end of my first term, they had a document that would circulate, one of the lobbyists circulated, a political reporter, where they would do a survey on who was the best freshman legislator in the House, and I was afforded that award.
Were you surprised by that?
Yes, I was.
Considering where you had started?
Yes, and to say I was pleased would be underestimating the response.
One of the issues that our oral history program is looking into more, I don't know that it's necessarily one on the high priority for you, but the ERA fight had started before you got there, and there was a fight every single year until 1982. And I wonder if you can, when you first got to the legislature, where a lot of the people had already pretty much solidified where they're at in the issue, your thoughts on ERA going in?
Sure. I was very strong on favoring the Equal Rights Amendment, but on the other hand, I was also strong in the pro-life movement, which some people, how can you be both? I said, well, I can respect women and their rights and also respect at the same time the sanctity of life. Elmhurst at that time was about 56% Catholic, and so there was somewhat of a heavy Catholic influence in town. And I had served on a committee called the Knight of Jewels Committee, which helped raise money for the Catholic Church, even though I'm not Catholic.
Knight as in K-N?
Knight, N-I-G-H-T,
Okay.
like the Knight setting, Knight
Okay.
of Jewels. And helped raise money for, which would help fund the Immaculate Conception High School. And I had a lot of friends that were in the Catholic Church, and with my own experience with my children, I really strongly believed in the sanctity of life and the moment of conception. So at the very start of my career, and I never changed, I was pro-life and pro-ERA. And people would come into my office and say, you can't be both. I said, I can be both. I said, I can respect women. I can respect their right to exceed and excel in business without having to go on the pro-choice route. So, but I do remember that fight, and it went. I wasn't visited very much because I didn't vacillate on the subject. I never told anybody I would change. I was going to vote for the Equal Rights Amendment. I was lobbied to change my position, and I said I wouldn't. So they really didn't bother me much, either side. They counted on my vote, and they counted that I would be against their position if they were against the ERA. But what a fascinating story. And I'm sure people like Susan Catania and others can tell you a long, long history on the ERA battle.
Was Susan one of the
very,
sponsors in the
very,
House?
very active Republican woman from Chicago. And that's an example of the multi-member districts. And Susan was very active in ERA. And she worked extremely hard on the movement, but she would know all of the ins and outs on it. But I remember we were coming up for a vote where we thought we had the votes to pass it, and all of a sudden there was a fire alarm, and we had to clear the Capitol. There was a bomb scare. We had to clear the Capitol. And when they came back, there were a couple legislators that were pro-ERA missing. They took a walk. And so it never got the necessary votes. And of course, George Ryan was anti-ERA. one of the strong opponents. And I remember when midnight rolled around the last day, the supporters of the ERA, primarily women, went up in front and sang "We Shall Overcome," and it was quite a moment. So,
Was that the 1982 battle?
Yeah,
Yeah, and that, of course, the clock was running down in the ERA at that time.
it
and,
was running down.
were you surprised that Illinois, of all states, ended up being one of the main battleground states?
Yeah, I kind of was. I thought Illinois would be a little bit more moderate in terms of their view on ERA. And I think today they would be.
Did you get a chance to know or meet Phyllis Schlafly?
Oh, yeah. Yes, Phyllis was not real fond of me because of my position, although she was not totally angry with me because I was pro-life.
What was your impression of her?
She was dedicated, she was strong-willed woman, definitely knew her subject matter, definitely had a viewpoint that she had studied very carefully and was articulate in her position.
Do you think the ERA would have passed in Illinois had it not been for Phyllis Schlafly and Stop ERA?
Without a doubt, she was a major influence on it not passing. And, you know, I can speculate that probably would have stood a better chance of passing if she was not so articulate and so capable on the other end.
Okay. Let's go back to your position on abortion. A couple years before you got to the Illinois legislature, the U.S. Supreme Court kind of took it away from legislators in the passage when they came down with their decision in Roe v. Wade. Did you think that was the right approach to resolving that issue?
Well, I think the right approach to resolving the issue would have been to let the states make a decision. I mean, you know, in terms of comparative government, states make different decisions for different reasons, and I would have favored a state-by-state response to that. I took a position that I would vote for a constitutional amendment protecting the sanctity of life, which meant that I would have voted for an amendment to overrule Roe v. Wade. I always thought it would be very difficult to get done, as it proved to be the case, and I don't think it'll ever be changed. I think that for the most part, we have strong-willed people that believe in one side or the other, but there's so many other problems that we need to deal with today, not to diminish the movement on either side, but we need to be focusing more on the quality of life and job creation and our economy and spending and so forth, that we need to focus more of our time on today.
Okay. Having spent most of your life in politics, as we go through this, I'm going to ask you your reflections on the various election cycles that we go through. So we're up to 1976, and now Walker is running for re-election.
Right. And
I wonder if you can kind of lay out that particular gubernatorial election.
Well, to the degree that I remember Michael Howlett running against him, and of course we had the crime fighter Jim Thompson as our candidate, and I of course met Jim early on. He came out to DuPage County, vote-rich Republican DuPage County.
Was Michael Howlett the Daley candidate?
Yes, and he was not only the Daley candidate, he was very popular. And frankly, a lot of people took odds at the very beginning that Michael Howlett would walk into the governorship. And that even though Jim Thompson had some ability, they thought that, well, you know, he prosecuted Bill Scott, you know, he laid some of the groundwork for other individuals, and he can't, and Otto Kerner, the end at Otto Kerner, and therefore he's not going to be very well liked and people aren't going to support him. Well, they had no idea that Jim Thompson would end up being one of the best campaigners we'd ever seen. And after I met Jim Thompson, right off the bat, I knew this guy has a lot of ability and is going to go far in government. And as we know, history tells us he won that election fairly handily. Of course, Michael Howlett beat Dan Walker in the primary, became the Democrat candidate against Jim Thompson.
Which says quite a bit in its own right.
It does. Well, you know, Dan Walker never built the coalitions, and government is about building coalitions. You can't function in the legislative process or in government unless you build support coalitions, and they can change over time. They can be a coalition on education. It can be a coalition on tort reform. It can be a coalition on probate. But unless you build those coalitions, people you can work with, talk to, and make deals with, you can't get government to function. Some criticize our current structure today because it's so polarized.
Okay, you mentioned that Thompson won handily. My number here says 65%. That's a landslide in anybody's book.
There's not a person alive that wouldn't take that election.
In
In fact, they would take 59%.
Yeah, absolutely. How about your own re-election bid? This is the first time you're running for re-election.
Right. No primary opposition. And I can't even remember who ran against me in the general election. I know Bill Redmond was on the ballot, but I don't know if he had another person running.
Was
So.
Gene Hoffman still on the
Oh
same
yes.
ballot?
Oh yes. Yeah. Gene Hoffman was until 1980. I think 1988 or something like that.
I'm not sure of the time frame here for Thompson's initiative on Class X legislation.
I'm not sure either. I think it might have been like 1979, somewhere in that area.
Well, let's back up a little bit, because I know there was a death penalty legislation
Right.
in 1977.
Right. The Supreme Court had ruled the death penalty to be unconstitutional, and then ruled later on that if it had certain standards in there, it could be constitutional.
You're talking about the U.S. Supreme
The
Court.
U.S. Supreme Court, yes, I am. And of course, Illinois' death penalty statute was part of the ruling of unconstitutional standing. So we had to either not do anything, in which case we wouldn't have a death penalty, or we would have to restructure the death penalty. I worked with a legislator from Chicago who was named Roman Kaczynski. No, I'm sorry, Romy Palmer, who now I believe is still a judge in Cook County. I think he's still a judge. He may be retired. But he and I sponsored legislation to restore the death penalty. As you know, I was a lawyer. I believed in the criminal justice system. I believed that the prosecutors had the ability to make educated and appropriate decisions on whether or not to seek the death penalty. I came from a law enforcement family. My father was chief of police of Michigan State Campus Police Force. My grandfather was state's attorney, and I was a lawyer and elected to the legislature. And I believe very, very strongly that we should have the ultimate punishment for a heinous crime. And we set certain standards and met the Supreme Court conditions and ultimately passed that into law. I spent a lot of time lecturing, debating, and putting that together on the House floor.
So you were one of the sponsors of the legislation?
Yeah, I was one of the chief sponsors.
Well, this is still pretty early in your legislative career. How did you, that's a significant piece of legislation that's going to get a lot of attention.
Right.
How did you get to that position?
Well, at the end of my first term, as I told you, I was fortunate enough to be named best freshman legislator. I had built a good amount of respect because I worked hard, I kept my nose to the grindstone, and I helped build coalitions and helping other people and learned the process. And so when this bill came up, I was on the Judiciary Committee, and initially I had a bill drafted by the Legislative Reference Bureau, and I decided to work with the Democrats and work together to get this done.
Was that one of the issues where you couldn't find Democrats and Republicans on the same side of the issue?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, you had some opponents to it. Most Republicans were for it. So working with my colleagues on the Republican side, I had a lot of support on that.
Did you have some who were very critical of you? You said there's some hypocrisy because you're so strongly pro-life and also for the death penalty?
You know, that was said a few times, but it wasn't that pervasive. And it does sound a little bit inconsistent, but in one case you have no choice. You're born, or your life is terminated by an abortion. In the other case, there is a choice. The choice is, if you're going to commit a heinous crime, you are going to be subject to the ultimate punishment that society has a right to level.
Oftentimes, political scientists would divide up politicians in the three kind of categories: your position on social issues, your position on fiscal issues, and your positions on crime and punishment issues. And how would you identify yourself then in those three?
Well, probably socially more moderate, fiscally conservative, and on crime and punishment, initially I was extremely conservative or strong in favor of appropriate crime and punishment, hence the sponsor of the death penalty, the three-time loser bill, which is a habitual criminal offender, convicted of 3 felonies, and you're going to go to prison for life. And one of the sponsors of Class X.
Okay. Well, we're in the neighborhood, then let's talk about the last two that you mentioned and the legislative battles for those two. The 3 strikes out. Let's start with that one.
Well, of course, crime had been picking up in Chicago, and people were more and more concerned about their safety, and we wanted to crack down on crime. A lot of times, a lot of legislators will talk about cracking down on crime and punishment. And so picking up the support for the 3-time loser bill wasn't that difficult. Remember, these are 3 felonies. So that's like a burglary with a weapon, manslaughter, murder, rape, 3 felony convictions, and you're facing life imprisonment. So putting together the necessary support for that was not that difficult, but writing the language that would meet the constitutional muster was really the critical part of it.
And the last one, the Class X legislation.
Well, that was pretty much instituted by Jim Thompson. I was one of the co-sponsors of that legislation because I believed in cracking down on the more heinous crimes.
Had he or his legislative aides approached you on that?
Oh, yeah. You know, the governor was very active in that legislation. He came from a criminal justice background, as you know, and so he was very, very firm about his belief on that. But most of that legislation was written by his staff.
Okay. Was that typical that the governor's office would draft the legislation?
Oh, sure. The chief legislator in the state many times is the governor. Now, he can't pass legislation, but he can lobby for legislation. So many times, depending upon the state, depending upon the political culture, depending upon what kind of leader he or she may be, many times you'll find the chief legislative leader is the governor of a state.
Okay. Tell us about some of the specifics in that piece of legislation.
Class X?
Yeah.
Increased prison time, increased Class X legislation called for a maximum of life in prison if you were convicted of a Class X crime, murder, rape, robbery with a gun. It can all be classified as Class X. Very tough piece of legislation.
Was that a close vote? Was that
it was debated at length. In my recollection, it was not a particularly close vote because a very popular governor at that time, Jim Thompson, was sponsoring it, was campaigning on it, and wanted to pass it. And my recollection was that it was not a particularly close vote.
Did the legislature, one, have an understanding of what that would do to the prison population in Illinois, and two, understand that they're going to have to do something to address that part of it?
They did, but you know, the importance of the punishment and the criminal justice system overweighed the factor that you'd increase the prison population, as frequently is the case.
Okay. I think you mentioned that was in 1979. That sounds right to me. We can make sure that's the case when we take a look at the transcripts. Let's fall back to the 78 election. Why is it that the governor is running again in 1978 after just winning in 76?
You had the changeover in the Constitution, and he ended up having only a 2-year term. And that's my recollection. So, and he had to run for a 4-year term.
Was that so that the governor of Illinois wouldn't have to compete with a presidential election?
Thank you. We went to the off-year election. And going to off-year election means a non-presidential year election, so that the issues that we're dealing with do not get confused with the national issues. Most states in this country have the elections for the governor in the off-year time.
Okay.
38, I believe.
One of the issues, I think this was a referendum on that particular ballot as well, was, what was it called? The Thompson referendum? The Thompson proposition, which was kind of picking up with Proposition 13 out in California, an anti-tax thing. Do you recall that on the ballot?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
The Thompson proposition, which was mirroring Proposition 13. Let's see. Attempting to capitalize on the nationwide popularity of California's Proposition 13. So
lowering taxes,
lowering
property
taxes or putting a cap on how much you can raise the
Yeah.
taxes.
You know, Thompson and later more successfully Jim Edgar campaigned on capping property taxes. One of the problems that you faced in that movement is that if you cap property taxes, you're limiting the amount of money that a school district can have for their schools. So that was always a concern in that. But every governor, generally speaking, would be in favor of keeping property taxes low. But they're competing, of course, with the school system, which is a problem that you'd face.
Well, it's no secret here that Thompson won another easy campaign against Michael Bacalus, won by a 60% margin, still very healthy.
Anybody would take it.
And as part of that campaign, I think he promised that he would veto any attempt to raise legislators' pay.
Can you imagine such a thing? Well, of course, did he say anything about his? Thompson, you know, I have a high degree of respect for Jim Thompson, a very high degree of respect, as I do for other governors. But Thompson was extremely bright, articulate, and smart, and he was kind of a visionary. So he knew that the movement in legislative pay was one that was a populist movement, and he tied right into it.
Moving against the pay raise.
Yes, yes.
What was the urge to get it increased?
With the urge to get the pay of legislators increased, we were too low, and we're looking for better salaries.
Was that a factor of that the legislature over time was becoming much more of a professional body versus the old school where it was citizen politicians?
In Illinois at that time, 1978, I believe, was the
Right.
time, we were starting to move more towards a professional legislative body. Had not made the movement totally yet, but the time commitment was more and more involved as the issues became more and more detailed. So with professionalism, with more full-time legislators, quote unquote, even though we're not a full-time legislative body, the urge to have a reasonable wage was one that many people felt was necessary.
I know in the old days, you would meet every other year. When did that practice stop?
Well, before I got there.
Late 60s, was it?
Yeah, and you also could collect your salary all at one time. So you could take your 2-year salary by one check in advance. And that was the case when I first started, but we passed a law changing that.
So is that part of the explanation then? I think you've already laid this out pretty well, but to get higher pay for the legislators if that's really their only career?
Well, it wasn't so much if that's the only career as it was the amount of time you were spending there. So whether or not it was their only career was not as important as the fact that we were spending a significant amount of time in Springfield, and the session went until July 1st. And many times in months of May and June you were there full time, and sometimes 24/7.
Okay.
And here's our railroad saying hello.
But it becomes an
Lincoln
issue,
Library.
obviously, in the '78 campaign where Thompson is making these promises that he will veto any legislation to raise your pay.
Right.
Well, what happened after the election? Do you recall?
I don't.
Okay. Well, this is one
But
of my...
I think you can refresh my
Yeah,
memory, and I
this-
can comment on it.
Well, yeah, I know you're going to have a lot of comment on it. As I understand, immediately afterwards, you know, what's the governor to do after being reelected? He goes on vacation, and I think he went to vacation in Florida. The legislature came in and had a vote to raise your pay. And Thompson immediately vetoed it. But because he immediately vetoed it, it gives you guys in the state legislature the opportunity to
Why we're still there.
veto,
To override the veto.
to override the veto.
Why we're still there. And I
Right.
think it was overridden, if I
Right.
recall correctly.
Correct.
And then people got very angry.
Well, yeah, that's kind of a kind word to say from what I
Yeah,
understand.
Pat Quinn, I think, had the teabag movement, didn't he? If I
Yes.
recall correctly. And Pat Quinn, that's one of the first efforts that he started to reduce the size of the legislature.
Yeah, that's basically the origin of the cutback amendment, which is
Right.
where this is all leading. So
Right.
why don't you walk us through the rest of that cutback amendment fight?
Well, Pat Quinn, the populist that he is, and is pretty good on seizing on a popular issue and taking the side that he was, started this movement to the teabag movement, so to speak. In fact, we got a lot of teabags in the mail. And his position was that the legislature was too big, too unwieldy, and by the way, having 3 people from one district is unnecessary. You should have only 1 legislator per district and eliminate cumulative voting. Huge mistake. History tells us it's a huge mistake. I thought at the time it was a huge mistake and argued against eliminating cumulative voting and argued against Quinn's position. And it so happens as time went on, I benefited from the cutback amendment because I became the Republican leader of the House in 1982, 83, and because we had fewer members, single-member districts, a lot of the influence of the leaders became more compact, confined, and important in terms of determining the policy of the caucus. Staffs grew because we had fewer legislators doing the work. And you'd say, well, why would they grow because of that? You'd think they would shrink. No, the staff, the professional staff had to grow to pick up some of the workload that we were facing because of the more complex issues. So the mistake, I think, in the cutback is we lost our minority representation. This district right here where you're sitting right now is an example of that. We would never have elected a Bill Redmond. And consequently, a Bill Redmond would never have become the first Speaker of the House from DuPage County, even though he was a Democrat. We would have never had the benefit of his expertise. We would never have had representatives from Chicago at any time. Art Telser, who was the majority leader of the House, a Republican. Pete Peters, a Republican. All of them from Chicago that distinguished themselves in their career. And having said that, we lose the minority representation in Chicago and, of course, the outlying suburbs.
Was this an issue that you could divide Republican versus Democrat?
Oh, no. No, it was, there were most, I think, I would say that most members of the House were probably opposed to the cutback amendment. And certainly a lot of members of the House were against losing the multi-member districts. Now, some hardcore political operatives said this is an opportunity for Chicago to be solidly Democrat. And boy, it's happened. I mean, you have approximately 36 legislators from Chicago, and only one of them has Republican ties. So it's kind of started to create the polarization of some of the party structure.
And you and other opponents to the cutback amendment anticipated that?
Yes. It was pretty obvious that not only would DuPage County lose its minority representation, Democrats, but Cook County would lose its minority representation. Susan Catania, whose name I mentioned before, was a minority district member Republican in Chicago. You get in our caucuses early on and you'd have Republicans arguing for Chicago legislation and why it was good for the people of Chicago and helpful to the state. You don't have that today because there's no one in our caucus today that's in there arguing for the benefit of Chicago.
And vice versa in the Democratic caucus.
For some of the suburbs.
Okay. Was this an issue that ever came to a vote in the legislature?
No. The constitutional amendment was created by Pat Quinn's efforts because it was amending the structure of the legislature and therefore did not need legislative action.
So who at that time was Pat Quinn?
He, at that time, I'm not sure exactly who he was.
He was not part of the legislature.
No, absolutely was not, nor was he a state official. He was out of Chicago. Do you remember?
I know he was in the legislature.
Yeah,
That's
no,
as
he
much
was
as I
not
know.
in the legislature. But that kind of, he rode that horse, and he rode the creation of CUB, Citizens Utility Board legislation, another populist movement on cutting utility rates. I'm not sure it has, but CUB still exists today. And that was another one of his efforts. He was a Chicago activist, but I don't remember his first political.
Was this really his breaking into the public
The
consciousness?
cutback amendment was. Now, as I said early on, I think it was a huge mistake. I did then, and I do today.
Okay. Well, I have to admit that talking to a lot of politicians, I haven't found anybody really who thinks it was a good thing.
Well, because if you believe in our system of government, and if you believe in the structure of democracy, you also believe in minority representation. And it's unfortunate that we lost. Glenn Snyder was another Democrat from DuPage County. He was from Naperville. Glenn Snyder would have never been elected to the legislature. He distinguished himself in education. He was the education leader on the Democrat side, and Gene Hoffman was the education leader on the Republican side, both from DuPage County. One Democrat, one Republican.
In these early years, the time before you become a minority whip, let's say, was there other
Majority whip.
Excuse me, majority whip.
Yes, it's
Very-
an important distinction.
Very important. Were there any other issues that you were really championing?
There is a number of, as I said, dealing with the disability community, the specialized living centers, and other issues of that nature were issues that I, throughout my whole legislative career, that I focused on.
I know that in one case, this 1981, you sponsored a bill about child car seats.
Right. And that's what started the child car seats. John Cullerton and I sponsored that legislation. And of course, as you know, John Cullerton today is the President of the Senate. And that was one of the first pieces of legislation in the country to place a child under 5 in a car seat.
Where was the opposition to that, or was there any?
Freedom. Why would you force us to place a child in the car seat? And during the course of the educational process, we showed them how in an accident a child becomes a bullet going through a windshield when there's a quick stop or a crash. And that's what started convincing people. But even then, there were people that said it's not government's role to be telling us we have to wear seat belts, which later on we did, telling us that we have certain restraints that we can't get along without, and government should not be doing that. A lot of times Southern Illinois legislators were opposed to that.
I know there was plenty of Southern Illinois Democrats, but was this also, my guess is there was plenty of Republicans who opposed it as well.
Yes, yes. If I recall correctly, there was a narrow vote on passage, but it passed and became law. And aren't we lucky?
Did you get any better or different committee assignments after the first couple years?
I stayed mostly on the Judiciary Committee, and I never got involved as a regular member in the appropriation process, but most of the time I was focusing on legislation dealing with laws, civil and criminal.
This takes us back to your first term. Just wanted to have you touch on your relationship with James Washburn.
Bud Washburn, as I said earlier, when I went down there, Dick Walsh was the odds-on favorite to be elected Speaker as a Republican. Something happened on the way to the election called Watergate, and the Republicans suffered a huge loss in that election of '74, including the loss of Dick Walsh to the House. So our favorite and the person that I had committed to was no longer a candidate. Well, Dick had a brother named Bill, who was also in the legislature, and I liked both of them, and Bill decided he was going to run for Speaker, or technically you're running for Speaker, but when you don't have the majority, you're running for Minority Leader. You have a caucus before the formal election, and in that caucus, the Republicans select their candidate and the Democrats select their candidate. We selected Bud Washburn. I supported Bill Walsh, so I had a little rocky start to begin with there as well. But when Bud Washburn became our candidate for Speaker, of course I threw my support to him. and hence getting in the Redmond election as Speaker. That kind of tells you the story there.
But were you able to reestablish a good rapport with him after this
It
whole?
was always a little rocky at times, but I became a very active individual legislator on legislation and resulting in.
I know the next time around, the '77 selection of the minority leader, George Ryan got it. How did you? Can you walk us through that sequence and where you were at with George Ryan?
Well, George Ryan really was running Bud Washburn. Bud Washburn, I always felt, was more of a reluctant leader. And Bud Washburn, nice man, very nice man. And I have nothing negative to say about Bud Washburn, but he was not the leader that George Ryan was or some other people. And George had a group of people around him that became very, very active and very powerful within the Republican caucus. Artie Telser, Pete Peters, people like that.
Lee Daniels?
I was not in that group initially. And of course, George became our candidate and was elected minority leader and served in that position until he was elected lieutenant governor.
In '78, then, were you happy to support Ryan?
Yes.
Was Washburn still in the system?
I don't think so. I think he stepped down at that point. He
Okay.
decided he didn't want. I don't think he liked the position at all. I think he preferred to be a regular member.
Okay. So there wasn't a nasty fight when Ryan
No.
became minority leader. Okay. Let's get to the 1980 election then, and let's start with the national level election. Now, what we hadn't really discussed up to this point, the obvious and very ugly economic situation the country was at that time, and I'm sure that Illinois was going through some pretty rough economic times as well.
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter.
It
Do you
was a
recall?
ugly time.
Yeah. Do you recall in the Republican presidential primary, who did you support?
Let's see. Jimmy Carter's opponent.
Well, Reagan's opponent
Yeah.
in the primary would have been George Bush Sr.
I would have supported Reagan.
in the primary.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
But up to this point, you've been describing yourself as something of a Republican moderate, and Reagan is clearly a different kind of Republican at the time.
He was our father. He was going to take care of us. He was going to make sure that everything was okay. It was a morning in America, remember? And the sunrise over the farm. Ronald Reagan made us feel good. Ronald Reagan gave us hope. Ronald Reagan would lead us out of these problems. And George Bush was not that inspirational.
Okay. Well, of course, Reagan wins the election. There was a lot of question on whether or not he's a conservative, as conservative as Reagan was at the time and was portrayed at the time, that he'd be able to do it. And of course, he swamped Carter.
Yes, as you weren't too surprised with. I mean, Carter had strong leadership from Elmhurst, Illinois. Really? Guy by the name of Reverend James Wall was from Elmhurst, Illinois, and a top advisor to Jimmy Carter.
Wasn't aware of that.
His wife went on. His wife actually was elected to the DuPage County Board as a Democrat during the Watergate election. But we didn't make those same mistakes twice.
So 1980 ends up being a big Republican year, and there's implications for Illinois legislature as well.
Right, right. And George Ryan actually was elected. Well, the Republicans won control of the House. I don't remember the exact numbers, but enough that the end of the day, George Ryan was elected Speaker of the House. And Bill Redmond, who was the Speaker of the House, then ran for minority leader on the Democrat side, only to be beaten by one of his top aides, Michael Madigan.
Which fight was uglier than the Democrat side?
Well, I wasn't too attuned to all the ins and outs on the Democrat side, but there was no question about the fact that Bill Redmond wanted to continue on as the Democrat leader. But at the end of the day, people understood they needed a stronger leader. Bill Redmond was a fair man and was not, particularly a strong, hardcore leader, where Mike Madigan was known to be more assertive in his political persuasion.
Okay. Let's get the other side of the legislature and what happened in your case.
Well, I ended up supporting George Ryan, as I said, and happy to see him elected Speaker of the House. I had, shortly before going down to be sworn in to my 4th term, got divorced, and so I was pretty disengaged at that point from the process. I did not particularly want the divorce, so I was fairly upset, and I remember getting on a plane and flying down to Springfield, and we had our caucus to select our leader, and that was George Ryan. And after he was selected as our candidate for Speaker, he called me to his office and he said, "I want to make you one of my leaders." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I think you do a good job, and I think you should be the majority whip." And I said, "Well, I was thinking more of a deputy leader or something like that." I really didn't care too much. And he said, "Well, you don't sound too excited." I said, "George, I just got divorced. I really don't care. You do what you want to do." And I left his office. And the next day he called me back. He said, "Look, I'm going to appoint you majority whip. Will you accept that appointment?" I said, "If that's what you want, I will."
Is that the 3rd ranking Republican?
It really is. It's really the lower level of the leadership team. And you had the majority leader, who was Artie Telser, Pete Peters, a deputy majority leader, and then you had, beyond that, I think like 5 or 6 down the road is the majority whip. And of course, they're charged with lining up votes, and George thought I could do that.
Okay.
And I could.
Were there any other aspects to the job? Was it primarily what happens when you're taking votes?
It's reflecting the position of the leader to the members. It requires you to have a good relationship with the members. And so I had to interact with the members a lot.
With the Republican members?
Yes, yes. That's when I started becoming more partisan, because you had to, because you're now articulating the Republican views. So if the leadership run by the Speaker decides to take a position on a piece of legislation, even if you might personally disagree with it, you're bound to that leadership position that was voted on in the leadership meetings to take that to the members.
Did you have any reservations because of that?
Not because of that. I had reservations at times on some of our positions, but I stated that in the leadership caucus. When George Ryan, every morning he would have a leadership meeting around his table, and we'd all come in, we'd discuss the legislation, take our position. George would make the final decision, and then we'd go out and implement them.
I'm a little bit off in here. I was going to ask you about Jim Edgar as a legislative liaison, but this would have been at the time frame that he just moved to the Secretary of State's office. But do you recall the relationship you had with him in the previous years as the legislative liaison?
Respectful. He had run for the House and lost his election in the House. And he was, of course, working in the legislative process, so we knew who he was, and it was a respectful relationship.
Okay. How about on the Senate side? I'm sure because you got James Pate Phillip from this district, that you've known him for a long time up to that point in time. Is this about the time frame that he's emerging as the Senate leader as well?
Yes, Bill Harris had been the Senate Republican leader, and he decided to step down, and Pate Phillip was elected as the Republican leader in the Senate. And they still control, the Democrats control the Senate. And I'm trying to think if it was, Cecil Partee was when I first joined, and then it became Phil Rock.
Phil Rock at this time, yes. So even though it's a good Republican year, it's not enough to swing the Senate over to the Republican side.
Right.
I don't know that you've told us, painted a picture of who James Pate Phillip is. Can you do that for us a little bit?
John Wayne. You don't need to say anything more. Straight talking, sometimes a little bullish, can be intimidated. He's a tall guy. He talk right to your face. Very strong views on certain matters. Regardless of the issue, he has a strong view. He was a strong leader. Towards the end, he worked a lot closer with his members than he did previously, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, towards the end, when he was president of the Senate, it's much harder to line up the votes than when you're a minority leader. And he ran a very strong caucus. He and I kind of started in politics together. He always viewed me as his son, stepson, if you want to say that. And so when we would have a disagreement, it bothered him a lot, because he always felt that I should pretty much at the end of the day do what he says. And of course, when I was Speaker, it's a separate part of our legislative process. And I had twice the members he had, and so I had, in that sense, twice the responsibility, or in some cases, twice the problems. And of course, managing a larger group is a lot harder than managing a smaller group. And so sometimes our positions conflicted, and it did cause friction, and particularly towards the end, we had a lot of friction. However, at the end of the day, we always came together.
I wanted to focus primarily on those early days, and you mentioned he could be intimidating. Did he have a little bit of the LBJ in him in that respect?
Oh yeah, he was a student of the process. He was the county chairman of the DuPage County Republicans, which, as we talked about earlier, was one of the strongest Republican organizations in the country. And you could always count on a Republican vote in DuPage County.
He also had the reputation of saying things that could get him in hot water. He was colorful in that respect.
Yeah, very colorful. He would make some comments that make you cringe.
Made you cringe.
Made everybody cringe, not just me.
But apparently he managed to get away with it?
Well, partially because that was Pate. Now, if I had made a comment of that nature, I would have been headline Tribune or something, because they didn't expect that from me. But with Pate, he was always strong in his views, always strong about certain issues, and would say some things that if I said them, people would be aghast. But with Pate, towards his career, they'd say, well, that's Pate. You sure know where he stands.
Well, we probably ought to have a couple anecdotes, the kind of things that would get him into trouble that he said.
Yeah, some of the things I'm not sure I want to repeat. He was very much opposed to the gay community, which we call LGBT today. He had trouble associating with minority populations, and in frequent cases he would be not as compassionate as you'd like him to be.
How about his views towards Chicago?
Oh, strongly opposed to Chicago. In fact, one time, Mayor Daley, the elder, I think was ready to send out a hit squad on him, because Pate put out a brochure of a spider with tentacles saying, and the spider was Mayor Daley, with tentacles reaching into DuPage and Kane and around the area, that he's trying to take control of our life and stop this nasty spider from taking control of your life. It was a pretty strong piece. But he would frequently have anti-Chicago comments coming out.
I'm sure we're going to take this issue of Pate Phillip and your role, especially in the 1990s, when a lot of this ended up being these discussions about tax swap and things like that, and during the Edgar administration. So we'll go back on some other things here. We've already talked about...
Yeah, and I just on Pate, we had our disagreements, but he was very helpful to me in my career. There's no ifs and buts about it. I enjoyed his support and sought his support, but we're both fairly strong people in our own way, and I'm not going to push him around, and he wasn't going to push me around. And at the end of the day, we did have our disagreements, but we did always come back together to do what was right.
Okay, the next subject is inside politics subject, and that's redistricting. Of course, with 1980, it's a census year, So how did the census and how did the redistricting work out for the Republicans?
It worked out very well, but you know, at that time the computers were not as sophisticated as they are today. So a lot of times you were drawing districts with a pencil, and then you were going and backing that materials up. You'd draw a district that would go, you know, and you'd take a map, big map, you'd blow up a map, and then you'd cover by the streets and draw the district that way, and then put the numbers on it to figure out if you have enough people in there and whether or not it meet potential constitutional challenge.
And this is the Illinois State Constitution now.
Right, right. And well, I mean, it could also be the federal constitution, because you can't violate equal protection.
Well, I know that the Illinois State Constitution, which was 1970 when that passed, had a provision in there that if there was some kind of a deadlock, there would be a drawing out of a hat, so to speak, to see if the Republicans or the Democrats would then essentially control the redistricting process.
Which history will tell you we lost most of the time on the draw.
Well, and I think when they crafted the Constitution in 1970, they said, well, they're never going to be
They're
foolish
never
enough.
going to do that, right. That's exactly right. And this is such an onerous thing that you'll know they'll never let it go to that way. Well, in essence, that's exactly what they do.
How did it work out in 1980 then?
It worked out in favor of the Republicans.
You won the draw.
Yes. And the map was drawn that basically helped the Republicans. And we won that, if I recall correctly, going back to 1980.
Okay.
It was actually 81 when the draw occurred, right?
Well, yeah,
Because
probably,
80 census, 81.
It takes a while for
Yeah.
the census to work through the process.
Yeah.
I think it was also 1981 that you were considering a different kind of political move.
Retirement?
No, you know what I'm talking about.
I do. At that time, Jim Thompson had appointed Ty Fainer as the Attorney General because there was a vacancy in that spot. And I had nothing personal against Ty Fainer, but not many people knew him. He obviously turned out to be an outstanding lawyer because he ran one of the biggest law firms in the country, Mayor Brown, and which has relationships everywhere. And I had a high degree of respect for him, but I was contemplating running for Attorney General. I was encouraged by a number of people. I was able to raise a good deal of money right off the bat, and I was traveling the state. And during the course of that travels, I, of course, ran into Ty Fainer a lot. We'd end up at the same events together. And we always treated each other respectfully. I mean, I didn't have anything bad to say about Ty Fainer. I just thought I would do a better job. And so, little side story, that's when I met my wife. And I met her in Rock Falls at a Congressman Tom Railsback golf outing. And I was going through the line, people were coming through the line greeting the, quote, dignitaries, unquote. And my wife Pam, my future wife Pam, came through. It was her first political event since the death of her husband. Her husband was a judge in Whiteside County and was at a judicial conference in Chicago and died of a heart infection. And she was called, she lived in Morrison, Illinois, out by the Mississippi.
What was her last name at the time?
Her married name was Renkes, R-E-N-K-E-S.
R-E-N?
Yes, K-E-S.
Okay.
Pamela Renkes. Her maiden name was Mesha, M-E-S-C-H. No, M-E-S, Mesha, C-H-A.
Okay.
And she's coming through the line, and I introduced myself, and she said, I'm Pam, and I said something like, you know, are you married? And she said, no, but I didn't hear it. You know, she said something like, no, my husband passed away, and I didn't hear that. There was a lot of noise in the background. I said, well, what does he do? And she said, well, he was a judge. And I said, well, how does he like being a judge? Pregnant pause. Everybody, didn't you hear what she said? He passed away. Oh, I'm so sorry. So I had my staff get her name so I could send her a note apologizing. And of course, I called her on the phone later on and asked her if she'd like to meet for a cup of coffee. And
Well, obviously, right from the beginning, you don't ask everybody right away, are you married?
Well, I don't think I actually said, are you married? I said, do you have children or something like that? I don't know. Anyhow, she was a very attractive young woman. And she was there at a political event, which interested me because I was looking for political support. She was a precinct committee man, and she had ended up running her husband's campaign for state's attorney and for judge.
Would it be fair to say at that time you're still hurting a little bit from the divorce?
Oh, I was hurting, yeah. Because it just was a bad experience. But
Okay, back to the Attorney General's race then.
yeah. So, not long after that, I'm down in southern Illinois, down in Williamson County. And Ty Fainer's down there and still campaigning throughout the state. And I get a message that Governor Thompson would like to see me. And so we set up a meeting, and I went in to see him. I said, what can I do for you? He said, well, I don't want you running against my appointment, Ty Fainer. I said, Governor, I understand. I don't mean to be disrespectful to you or Ty. I just think I can do a better job, and I think I can win this. And he said, well, you know, that's a matter of opinion, obviously, but I really have something else in mind for you. And I said, well, what might that be? And he said, I really think you should take George Ryan's spot in the House. And I said, you mean as minority leader? He said, yeah, you're a good legislator. You can handle my legislation in the House, and I could really use you there. And I said, well, if I were to stop running for Attorney General, do I have your support for Republican leader? He said, absolutely. I'll give you my support. So I thought it over, and frankly, I knew that it was going to get tougher and tougher to raise money, and ultimately made the decision that I would drop out of the Attorney General's race, endorse Ty Fainer, and accept the governor's suggestion. Now, it is a suggestion because the governor doesn't have a vote in the Republican caucus for minority leader.
And George Ryan's not going away, is he?
George Ryan was running for lieutenant governor.
Okay. So, to back it up, I know that Ryan wanted to be Secretary of State.
Absolutely.
When Thompson appointed Jim Edgar.
Right.
Because he had the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that was the carrot to throw to Ryan, was the...
Lieutenant governor.
Okay.
And George Ryan's running for lieutenant governor, Jim Thompson's running for governor, and I drop out of the Attorney General's race and decide to run for minority leader of the House, assuming that Thompson, Ryan are going to be elected. Well, regardless, George Ryan would have been out of the House because he wasn't running for re-election. So Governor Thompson won the election. George Ryan became lieutenant governor, and I had George Ryan's support and Jim Thompson's support, but it wasn't enough. And there were about 7 people that wanted to be the Republican leader, and it was pretty spirited at the start. And from Tom Ewing to Jack Davis to myself to Jim Riley were all potential candidates for Republican leader. One key swing group were the women, and it was important to get the 7, I think it was 7 votes, don't hold me to the number, but the votes of the women, which would be a block which could help you make the next step. And that required several meetings that took place, and I did have those meetings for and did ultimately get the support of the women legislators for Republican leader. Tom Ewing ended up dropping out and supporting me, which brought a few more votes. And the last person that ran against me was Jack Davis, and he ultimately dropped out when he knew I had enough votes. My campaign was being managed by none other than Gene Hoffman, with the support of a guy by the name of Sam Vinson from Clinton, Illinois. Sam was schooled in the legislative process, actually worked for Thompson, and became a legislator. And so he knew the process, and he was pretty skilled legislatively in putting coalitions together.
Vincent with a T?
V-I-N-S-O-N.
Okay, Vincent.
Sam is a lawyer, and today is with a Chicago law firm and very successful. In fact, Sam was the lead lawyer on the recent Capitol bill challenging the Quinn bill for the liquor tax and video gaming, and argued the case in the Supreme Court. Today, Sam is still one of my close personal friends.
Did it help coming from DuPage County, a collar county, core of collar county Republicans? Is that one of the issues that really can push you over the top on it?
Oh, absolutely, because if anyone wants to run for statewide office, they have to come through DuPage County. Not only that, I had the support of Pate Phillip. Again, as I mentioned, Pate was very helpful in my career. And Pate was making some calls. George Ryan made some calls. Governor Thompson let it be known that I was acceptable.
And Thompson can be convincing, I would guess.
And to some people, there was a little bit of pushback because they didn't want Thompson naming who the leader would be in the House, because then are we supposed to adopt all of his viewpoints, which they later found out that I didn't adopt all of his viewpoints.
I want to kind of take a step back and get your perception of, well, the Democrats, especially when Richard J. Daley was in control, the process was that the slate makers met in one of those dark rooms, smoke-filled rooms, and he's kind of controlling who ends up being the candidate for all of these major, not just Chicago elections, but statewide elections as well. And I understand, at least, that the Republicans kind of had their own version of the slate makers. Is that a misnomer?
No, it's not a misnomer. It's not as strong as the Chicago form, and which, of course, is still pervasive today in Chicago. Not always as strong as it has been in the past, but you would have many times the Republican quote leaders. That's the constitutional officers, the state party chair, the Republican leader in the House and in the Senate, and they would get together and start talking about who some of the candidates ought to be and some of the favored candidates. And they would have a pretty broad spectrum of not only who is a capable candidate, who can raise the money, which is also very important, and who can articulate the position. So, yeah, you'd have some form of slate making, but not as formal as the Democrats.
Okay. I would assume, though, that the slate making isn't necessarily at play when it comes to positions like the minority leader or majority leader.
No, no, because the members of the House and Senate guard very carefully their vote for who their leader is.
Okay. Once you're selected as the leader in the House, the Republican leader, is it difficult to get beyond some of the resentment since there's so many other candidates?
In my case, I was able to do that by appointing some of my opponents to the leadership position. Jack Davis became part of my leadership. Jim Riley became part of my leadership. Tom Ewing became part of my leadership.
Okay.
And of course, Gene Hoffman. Penny Poland. I actually have pictures of my first leadership.
Okay. So this is 1983. Are we about time where we need to take a
pause that for a second?
Okay. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start this again, but only to conclude today's session.
Okay.
Okay, we just decided that we're at the point of time, since the speaker has a meeting at 11:30, we're going to call it a day and pick this up in the next session.